Imagine waking up to a scratching sound outside your shelter. You step outside, and the freezing wind immediately pulls the heat out of your fingers before you can even lift a weapon. You grab your spear just as a starving wolf launches straight at your throat. You brace, drive the spear through its chest, and win. You just killed an apex predator in the freezing cold with your own hands. And yet, you still wouldn't even come close to surviving the hardest challenge in ancient human history. But to find out what that absolute limit is, we'll be going on a journey through the most brutal survival events in existence. All starting with the daily commute. The raw ingredients needed to defend a human from a predator are surprisingly cheap. You just need a heavy wooden stick, a sharp chunk of flint, and enough nerve to not blink when something the size of a wolf runs at you. Killing a predator is terrifying, but surviving one is essentially just a straightforward physics equation. You don't try to out-wrestle it, you calculate the distance, you throw the rock or drive the spear, and the biological machine stops working. It is a binary system. You either miss and die, or you hit and get a massive pile of free meat. But defeating a wild animal is basically the lowest rung on the survival ladder, because fighting a hungry beast is child's play compared to fighting the planet itself. During the last glacial maximum, the Earth wasn't just cold, it was constantly, aggressively trying to extract the heat right out of your muscles. Surviving the Ice Age wasn't about adrenaline or bravery. It was a ruthless accounting game. A human body in freezing temperatures burns a massive amount of calories just to spasm and shiver enough to keep the heart beating. Therefore, your entire existence becomes a math problem. You have to find more calories in a frozen wasteland than you are burning by simply standing there. And since the ground is covered in ice, there are no berries. There are no tubers. You can't forage. You have to hunt. But here's the terrifying part of that math problem. If you only eat lean muscle meat from the animals you hunt, you will literally starve to death with a full stomach. It is a biological glitch called protein poisoning. Your liver simply cannot process infinite amounts of lean protein without toxic byproducts building up in your blood, so you need fat. Fat is the most dense fuel source on the planet, but animals in the Ice Age are starving too, which means they don't have a lot of fat on their bodies. So ancient humans had to rely on a brutal, exhausting, everyday chore. Archaeologists constantly find animal bones at Ice Age kill sites that haven't just been scraped clean. They have been completely shattered. Someone sat in the freezing wind, placed a horse femur on a flat rock, and smashed it to pieces with a heavy stone. They were manually extracting the bone marrow, a thick, incredibly calorie-dense paste, just to keep their internal furnaces from shutting off. Smashing bones for fat wasn't a snack. It was the literal fuel required to balance the caloric math of the ice. But the Ice Age was a slow, predictable enemy. You knew it was cold, you knew you needed fat. You could plan for it. You could stitch heavy hides together to trap the heat. But what happens when the environment breaks without any warning at all? To find a survival challenge significantly harder than a frozen planet, we have to look at what happens when an entire ecosystem just evaporates. Literally. Hundreds of thousands of years ago in ancient Africa, the climate would occasionally undergo massive, violent shifts. Massive lakes that sustained entire ecosystems for centuries would just turn into dust bowls in a matter of decades. These were mega droughts. When your local water source turns to cracked mud, you can't just adapt your hunting strategy. You can't invent a better bone needle. You have to move. You have to take an entire community of exhausted, dehydrated, stressed out humans and walk across hundreds of miles of barren, hostile rock. And you are doing this entirely based on the hope that the oldest person in your group correctly remembers where a tiny spring was located half a century ago. It is a logistical nightmare. Dehydration doesn't just make you thirsty, it destroys your cognitive function. Your brain literally shrinks inside your skull. Decision-making collapses. So migrating across a desert requires extreme discipline. Someone has to ration the remaining water. Someone has to carry the infants. Someone has to keep walking when their muscles are cramping so violently they can barely stand. It tests the absolute maximum limit of human collective effort. This wasn't one guy throwing a spear. This was dozens of people functioning as a single organism just to reach the next puddle. But migrating only works if there is actually somewhere better to go. Walking away from a drought makes perfect sense if it's raining in the next valley. You just pack up and walk toward the green grass. So what do you do when the entire sky turns off? All the challenges we've talked about so far have practical solutions. You stab the wolf, you smash the bone, you walk to the water. But the hardest survival challenge in human history is the one where every single solution was taken away at the exact same time. 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in Indonesia called Toba erupted. It didn't just blow its top. It violently ejected roughly 700 cubic miles of solid rock, toxic gas, and ash into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, if you took every single building, car, and person in New York City and launched them into space, Toba still threw out more garbage. The sound of the explosion would have ruptured the eardrums of anyone living within hundreds of miles. But the blast wasn't the actual problem. The ash cloud rose into the stratosphere and rapidly wrapped around the entire planet, and it blocked out the sun. The sun simply didn't come out for years. This triggered a global volcanic winter. Global temperatures plummeted in a matter of months. And when the sun goes away, photosynthesis stops. When photosynthesis stops, the plants die. When the plants die, the massive herbivores starve. And when the herbivores starve, the humans who rely on smashing their bones for marrow drop dead. The global food chain instantly collapsed. It didn't matter if you were a master hunter. It didn't matter if you had the sharpest flint spears in the world. You cannot hunt an animal that has already starved to death. You cannot migrate to a greener valley because there are no green valleys left on Earth. Everywhere is dark. Everywhere is freezing. Everywhere is raining toxic sulfuric acid. And the result was absolutely terrifying. Geneticists can look at modern human DNA today and read our history like a barcode. And right around 74,000 years ago, they see a massive, terrifying genetic bottleneck. The total population of humans on Earth plunged off a cliff. Some estimates suggest the global human population dropped to roughly 10,000 individual adults, not in one city, on the entire planet. You could fit the entire human race into a minor league baseball stadium with room to spare. We were functionally extinct. We were a mathematical rounding error away from being completely wiped out forever. You and I and everyone you have ever met only exist because a few thousand terrified people managed to not die in the dark. Surviving a decade-long night where the sky is falling and everything you eat is already dead seems biologically impossible. But how those final 10,000 people actually pulled it off changes everything we know about ourselves. You would assume that surviving a pitch-black apocalypse required the most ruthless, aggressive humans. You would think the survivors were the ones who hoarded resources, built walls, and killed anyone who came near their tiny scrap of rotting meat. But it was exactly the opposite. The Toba eruption didn't just kill us, it filtered us. When resources drop to absolute zero, a group of selfish individuals will tear each other apart. If you only care about yourself, you will eventually sleep, and when you sleep, you will die. The only groups that survived the darkness were the ones capable of extreme, unprecedented social cooperation. They survived because they stopped acting like isolated families and started acting like highly networked systems. They shared data. If one hunter found a dead animal, he didn't eat it alone in the dark. He dragged it back to feed the group. They pooled what little they had. They communicated complex plans around the fire. They began relying entirely on the collective intelligence of the tribe rather than the physical strength of the individual. The bottleneck eliminated the humans who couldn't cooperate. The people who walked out of the volcanic winter a decade later weren't just the strongest. They were the smartest, the most cooperative, and the most fiercely social creatures on the planet. And that is the massive reframe. The Toba supervolcano is the hardest survival challenge in history, not because of how many people it killed, but because of what it created. It forced an evolutionary leap. By pushing our species right to the absolute brink of total annihilation, it forced our ancestors to develop complex language, intricate trade networks, and deep social bonds just to stay alive. The disaster didn't pause human progress. It forged it. It turned us from clever apes holding sharp rocks into the apex engineers of the planet. All the wealth, all the towering cities, all the technology, and all the modern comforts we have today. We didn't get them because life was easy. We got them because 10,000 exhausted, freezing people decided to share their food in the dark. How did ancient humans actually survive getting sick? That next.